also is incomplete. Wealth by itself is also incomplete. Wealth also requires knowledge and compassion to back it, to be effective in society. We need to change from within. Mind is a monkey. At 64 plus, my greatest challenge in life is to keep my mind still. My mind is all over the place. It's hopping around from thought to thought. Not all my thoughts are positive. I feel anger. I feel frustration. I feel jealous. So the war that is required, a constant war, is within ourselves. And if we can achieve that little day-to-day improvement, as Amma said this morning, we must change. We must make that incremental progress so that we are useful to society at large. And our time on earth is very precious. Make full use of it in this search for knowledge. Vidya. Vidya is the primary requisite for all transformation. As our great culture teaches us, Vidya dhadhati vinayam, vinaya adhyati patratam, patravad dhanamapnoti dhana dharmak tatah sukham. Knowledge creates humility. Vidya dhadhati vinayam, vinaya adhyati patratam. If we are humble, we can build better character. Patravad dhanamapnoti. A good character, good knowledge, good education can help us to earn some wealth. Dhanata dharma tataha sukham. But that wealth has to be applied in a positive way. And this requires a group effort also. Our country today is on a high growth trajectory in a world which is tortured, which is fractured, where multilateralism, as the topic suggests, the topic for today, reform multilateralism in a changing world. In a difficult and challenging world, India is going to give voice to the global south, not just to the millions of our people, but to the people of the world. But a group effort is required. A group effort by the global community. A world in which no single power today is capable of making its writ felt on every issue at all times in every part of the world. It's an imperfect world. Multilateralism is greatly weakened. The United Nations that was set up in 1945 represents a bygone era. Much has happened since then. The balance of power has shifted. The world has moved away from bipolarity of the Cold War to the unipolar decade of the 1990s. But today in the 21st century, ladies and gentlemen, the world is moving towards multipolarity. And India is also emerging as a very important economic power. More than economic power in this fractured world, India is emerging as a beacon of values, of ethics, all the good things that Amma spoke of this morning. For what is knowledge? What is wealth? What is power? Without ethics, without values, without a new moral compass to take this world forward onto a new path for the benefit of all. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. I see before us in this hall today people from all over the world. That is India's ethos of inclusivity, of incorporating, of assimilation, of tolerance, not one of rejection, not one of exclusivity, not one of exceptionalism. That is not India. India is a country that has never aggressed against any other country. It is the land where thousands of years ago, our ancients have taught us through the Vedas and the Upanishads, through the teachings of Gautam Buddha, later Mahatma Gandhi, that peace and development, love and compassion are important. And that is where India is going to take the global community ahead in the 21st century. But this requires a group effort. The imperfections of the global system are well known. The United Nations has not transformed itself. It is a creature of the Second World War, of the power structure as it prevailed then. That is not the power structure that prevails today. But it also does not mean that we oppose multilateralism. It is greatly weakened. It is imperfect. The need of the hour is not to reject multilateralism, but to try to reform it, to try to take it in the right direction. Again, India is one country under the G20 presidency that can point the world to this new direction and give it a new moral compass. But this requires a group effort. The great challenges that the world faces today, whether it is of climate change, whether it is of the COVID pandemic, whether it is the friction between great powers, as we saw even in the pre-COVID period between China and the United States, and now this war in Ukraine, this is upending the global order as we know it. It has caused great stress and disruption with regard to food, fertilizers, energy. But it requires a group effort to resolve these issues. Yatha kena rathasya chakrena bhava evam purusha karena vina daivam na siddhyate. Just as a chariot cannot move on one wheel, so also destiny cannot be realized without effort. And that is how the global community is required to unite today under the leadership of India in G20 to make perfect, to reform this international order. Friends, today the world is reeling on account of tensions along 6 main axes or factors. The first is trade. Trade is fungible. It is a result of globalization as we have seen it over the past several decades. But yet trade today is the source of much tension, of sanctions, of protectionism. But not all of it is within the control of powers as they contest with one another. It has a logic of its own. Demand and supply, market forces. India's trade, even with a country like China, post-Galwan, has only increased. That is also the case in regard to trade between the United States and China. And trade is not a bad thing. We must trade with one another, but we must do so in a fair and equitable manner. The other source of tension, the second of the 6 T's as I call them, is technology. The world is moving rapidly into new technologies, emerging technologies. It is moving into artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, big data, drone technologies, clouds. Data is the new gold. And technology today is also being weaponized. There is greater success in this regard. In semiconductors, the kind of sanctions, restrictions put in place. And the future will bring new technologies, the consequences and impact of which are unknown today. The third T is that of territory, territorial contests. This desire, this greed for territory, irredentist claims going back into history, real or fictional. We can see it in Ukraine. We can see it in the Indo-Pacific. We can see it in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the Himalayas. Everywhere we see this contestation about territory. The fourth is the T of terrorism. For without peace and stability, without terrorism disrupting progress, there can be no development. In our part of the world, we have suffered terrorism for a very long time. Yet, the world woke up to this threat only after 9/11. And today it is a global threat. Yet, the global community has been unable to agree on a definition of terrorism. The United Nations Security Council that was set up in 1945 has privileged powers with vetoes. In the 21st century, 77 years after this institution was set up for another era, there is still this great power exceptionalism. And great powers tend to veto many things. Even the common definition of terrorism has eluded the UN Security Council. It has proved itself ineffective on many counts, including handling the COVID pandemic. More so, it is today divided with regard to the war in Ukraine. It has not lent itself to any kind of change, the UN Security Council. If in 1945 there were 51 members of the United Nations, today there are 193. Yet the UN Security Council has been reformed only once. In the early 60s, 4 years of negotiations in the ECOSOC led to a resolution in 1965 expanding the number in the UN Security Council from 6 to 10, taking the entire number from 11 to 15. But that change was cosmetic, only in the non-permanent category, and there has been no change since then. A country like India, with all the attendant qualities and qualifications to sit in the UN Security Council, still remains out of that decision-making power. Beyond terrorism, the fourth T is that of tenets. Tenets as in narratives. Today there is this great discourse about whose narrative is better, whose model for development, governance, cultural and social systems is superior. Is it democracies? Is it autocracies? And the tools that are available today, social media tools, information tools, etc., only make this worse. For there is scope for disinformation, for affecting the choices that people make. There is also the T of trust, which is greatly lacking today. The sixth T of trust is today important because there is utter lack of trust. The global community doesn't trust one another. Again, it is a country like India that can step in over here. Ladies and gentlemen, India's rise is well known. In the last 8 to 9 years, India has made tremendous progress. India has implemented many schemes that have brought about gender equality, that have made India a new nation with hope and aspiration, with the youth that comprise a very large part of our demography playing a very key role. It is an India that has delivered digital public architecture and infrastructure to its people through the Jan Dhan and Aadhaar schemes delivered on mobile platforms. India has successfully brought in marginalized sections of our people into the mainstream of economic and political life. It is an India that is taking initiatives in regard to a number of issues. India is no longer a bystander or an observer. It is shaping outcomes. The G20 is a very important group. It gives us hope and optimism. In a world which is imperfect, a world in which the UN Security Council and its affiliated bodies, whether the WTO, which has been dysfunctional for many years, or whether the WHO, where the politics of the pandemic took precedence over the priorities of healthcare for the global population. In all these, we have seen imperfections, the inability to work together. But the G20 provides us hope because it is an inclusive grouping of the 19 countries and the EU. 20 of the world's largest economies are in this grouping, and they are not required to focus on political issues, not on geopolitics, but on developmental issues. At least that is the basis for the G20. When it was formed as a result of the Asian financial crisis in 1997, later upgraded in the wake of the two global financial and economic crises in 2007 and 8, the G20 emerged as a very important apex level body in which such deliberations and consultations could take place on key issues like debt distress, which affects 75 countries today, like global warming and climate change, which affect all of us today. Global warming does not recognize any borders. It is a transcontinental international issue, like healthcare. Until everyone is safe in the era of pandemics, nobody is safe. So this is, ladies and gentlemen, an era of polycrisis. The new words are perma-crisis also. And a country like India, therefore, can play a role. The G20 is an opportunity for the world to come together, to bring the focus of development, finance back into the agenda. The G7 is part of the G20. All the 5 permanent members are part of the G20. It is an opportunity for the major powers to step away from their major power contestation, to pull away from the gridlocked highways of geopolitics, to treat the G20 as a wayside station where they can sit together, away from the traffic jams on the highways of geopolitics, to discuss something that would benefit mankind. There are many unique features of India's G20 presidency. It is the first time that 4 developing countries are chairing the G20 back to back. Indonesia last year, India this year, Brazil next year, and South Africa the year thereafter. This is therefore a great opportunity to bring the discourse back onto issues that matter, on which we can try and evolve some consensus, not the issues that divide us. It is unique because it is for the first time that an entire country, 1.4 billion people, are being involved in this exercise, with hundreds of events taking place around the country in all states and union territories. That is the uniqueness of India's G20. As the Prime Minister has said, we want it to be decisive, inclusive, action-oriented. For the G20 represents 85% of the world's GDP, 75% of global trade, and 2/3 of the global population. The G20 should speak up for the global south. That is why the Prime Minister of India engaged 128 countries, leaders from 128 countries, at the Voice of the Global South summit held in February this year. It is therefore truly an all-inclusive, all-encompassing structure that should be fully utilized. One of the most important aspects of India's G20 is to bring focus back onto climate change and protection of the environment. And you people sitting here in Kerala, in God's own country, will appreciate what I'm saying. These great bounties of nature that you have, the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the food that we eat, is today either depleted or, worse still, polluted. Even worse still, it is the subject of politics. And we therefore need to focus on what the Prime Minister of India, Shri Narendra Modi, has spoken about: lifestyle for environment, creating pro-planet people, allowing millions of people like the young people in the room today to become climate warriors, climate action warriors, to act responsibly towards Mother Nature, to protect the resources of the earth, to use them judiciously, to be accountable in terms of our consumption, to promote a circular economy, to repair and recycle as much as we can, so that we leave behind an earth with its bounties intact for future generations as well. Mahatma Gandhi had also said that this world, this earth, has enough to meet everyone's needs, but not to meet everybody's greed. I think this message came out very strongly in Amma's message also this morning. Need to respect our environment. India has become a climate change leader today. the one sun, one world, one grid concept that the Prime Minister of India proposed at COP26. His proposal to have resilient infrastructure for island nations, low-income countries that are worst affected by the frequent cyclones and typhoons and tsunamis. This proposal to create an entire generation of pro-planet people. This shift that we are making towards green energy, Panchamrit as it's called, to not only achieve net zero by 2070, but also to ensure that we have 500 gigawatts of power coming from non-fossil sources, to ensure that 50% of our matrix will be from renewables by 2030, to ensure that we reduce our emissions by 1 billion tons by 2030, or to ensure that the carbon intensity in our economy is kept below 45% by 2030. That kind of path-breaking proposal made by India will also set the tone for climate action. In the digital world today, there is a very real threat of moving towards what I might call cyber colonization, digital poverty, inequality. For data is the new gold. If you have the servers, you have the control over undersea cables. If you control the meta space, you control the browsers, you control everything. You control the minds of people around the world. You control information. The laws at the international level have not kept pace with these technologies. And this can also become a source for future malcontent, dissent, even wars. There are countries that have already said that a cyber attack will be deemed as an attack, as a kinetic attack. And it can result in wars. We have to keep this in mind as we handle technology. We have to ensure that the digital public infrastructure is available to all. And India can share its own experience with others. The largest number of financial transactions in the world today are conducted in India today at zero cost. A friend from Malaysia said that they have to pay for every transaction they make on their mobile phones. In India, you do it at zero cost. This is something we can offer to the global south. We can take them along with us based on our experience. There is also the important issue of reforms of the multilateral development banks and the international financial institutions in this imperfect multilateralism that exists before us. These, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, these are also structures that were created in 1945 as a result of the end of the Great War. They also represent, as creatures of the power structure prevailing then, they represent more the interests of the elite, the permanent members of the Security Council. I ask you a question. Why is it that the special drawing rights of the IMF, even today, do not correctly reflect the relative share of the country's GDP in the global GDP? For that was the foundational principle for creating SDRs. Today, India contributes something like 3.4% of the global GDP, but its special drawing rights are 2.75%. There are spent powers in the UN Security Council who may contribute only 3.2% to 3.25% of the global GDP, but their share in the SDRs is 4.75%. This requires review. It requires compassion. None of the goals addressing debt distress today in large part of the world today, many geographies, on account of the COVID pandemic, post-pandemic recovery challenges, the war in Ukraine, the challenge of having adequate finance to meet the climate change problem. This cannot be achieved unless lending is reformed. That we have reform in lending, there is hybrid lending, there is participation of public and the private sectors together, that the rich loosen their purse strings to provide adequate financing to deal with debt distress. Only once have the voting rights, special voting rights, been increased in 2007, 2008 from 250 to 750. Thereafter, change has remained frozen in the multilateral development banks and the international financial institutions. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me end at this point to say that multilateralism is imperfect, it is fractured, it is weakened, but we don't have to oppose multilateralism through the G20. We have to work with it. We have to convince all the powers in the world to work together. We have to try and see how we can improve multilateralism. We cannot afford to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And this will require a joint effort. Udyamena hi karyani siddhyanti na manorathaya na hi suptasya simhasya pravishanti mukhe murga. Again, our ancient logic, the shlokas, the teachings tell us that only hard work, udyamena, industriousness, will enable us to achieve our goals and objectives. Even a sleeping lion cannot hope to have a meal unless he works for that meal. He has to get up and hunt. The deer will not come automatically and enter the mouth of a sleeping lion. Udyamena hi karyani siddhyanti na manorathaya na hi suptasya simhasya pravishanti mukhe murga. So let us all once again rededicate ourselves, especially the youth, to working together. And the international community is represented here today. I can see it. Let us work on that concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Let there be enough for the wants of everybody. Let there be compassion. The right place to rededicate ourselves is also Amma's ashram. Thank you very much. Namaskar.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Chinoy, for your words of wisdom. The points that you touched upon is truly inspiring for the students and all those who have gathered here and online. Thank you again for your insightful message. Now, I'd like to invite Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, Principal Coordinator, C20 India, the chief guest for the occasion. Shri Vijay Nambiar has served as a former special advisor to the UN Secretary General, Sri Ban Ki-moon. Prior to this, he was Deputy National Security Advisor to the Government of India and head of the National Security Council. He has also served as an ambassador to several countries in Asia and the US. During the course of his professional career in the Indian Foreign Service, he has served in numerous bilateral and multilateral appointments in Beijing, Belgrade, and New York. He was involved at the delegation level in numerous UN and non-aligned summits and ministerial conferences since 1979. It's a true honor to have Sri Vijay Nambiar address the gathering. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. After that very rousing and inspiring statement, which Ambassador Chinoy, who will permit me to call him Sujan, it's a difficult act to follow. Now, but I've chosen a different kind of path. I thought I'll probably be provocative rather than, Let me first of all, of course, present my own humble salutations to Amma as Chair of Civil Society 20. Her inspiring words today have actually once again brought us back, as it were, to the center, to the central theme, as it were, of our lives and indeed of all values. As Sujan has said, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have problems, you don't look the other way. You look at it frontally and try to resolve them. Friends, I think that same approach should characterize the reform of a resilient United Nations. The United Nations has been, in a sense, badly in need of updating, but you don't throw out the United Nations because it doesn't represent what has happened. Now, when you ask an ordinary Indian citizen about the UN, the first thing he says is, when will India get a permanent seat in the UN Security Council? They may have little understanding of the range and magnitude of the work of the UN, but are generally conversant with the prestige and legitimacy of the UN Security Council, and of course, also its role in international peace and security. They are also most of the time aware that we send a lot of peacekeepers around the world. India needs to be, as they said, on the high table. Just 2 days ago, no, just last week at the Inception conference in Nagpur, one of the speakers said that if you are not on the high table, the chances are that you may be on the menu. Now, we have only just to recall the initial days of the Ukraine crisis. At that time, I had contacted some insiders in the UN, including diplomats who had long exposure with the UN. There was little surprise or alarm at the dramatic development. In fact, Russia was chair of the UN Security Council during that month of February and announced it in a routine manner as a special operation. The Secretary General himself said that this was the saddest moment of his tenure, but he did little during the several preceding months before this actual attack took place. Many were waiting for the Russians to wrap up the entire operation and finish off with it, and then they would turn the page and move forward. Now, how different that situation was from the situation in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. Then, within days, the Security Council adopted Resolution 678, authorized the use of all necessary means, and the USSR representative, it was the USSR, not Russia then, declared somberly that those who breach the peace should know that all necessary means would indeed be taken inexorably against them. This time, Russia treated the Council with complete disdain. It is only when Kiev refused to crumble and the operation began to falter that the indignation of member states started to build up. Yet, clearly, this is not the first time a P5 member has been doing this, taking unilateral action. Now, what was the impact of this so-called double standards of the great powers on the legitimacy of the world body? Why should smaller nations of the world support the claim of any country, even of India, to be a Security Council member, if this is what big powers do? Now, clearly, realists will argue that the behavior of individual states should not actually be used to question the legitimacy of an institution, and that the reality of big and small states is something which you can't escape from, nor for that matter can you escape from the question of a veto power, because we know from the predecessor of the United Nations that if countries are not able to exercise the veto, they will just leave the organization. A colleague of mine, on the other hand, recently said that in composition and structure, the G20 is better suited than the Security Council to deal with existential issues, as members have no veto. A reformed Security Council will never materialize within the framework of the present charter. I don't agree with this thesis. Bodies like the G20, BRICS, and SCO, I might say as principal coordinator of the C20, that they are ultimately only partially representative bodies and do not possess either the universality nor the larger convening power of the United Nations. And as such, they cannot be considered as eligible to replace the United Nations. The G20 countries is only a club, an influential club, no doubt, but a club nevertheless. Not only does it exclude 174 of the 193 nations who are members of the United Nations, but it is self-selected. It has no charter. It lacks accountability to any formal institution, and indeed, its actions are not even governed by international law, technically at least. Interestingly, to many observers, that may represent, in fact, a quality. The G20 represents a trade-off between legitimacy on the one hand and effectiveness on the other. Paradoxically, many claim that the G20 is more effective precisely because of its informal nature, its lack of a secretariat or eligibility requirements for membership. Ultimately, it is effective because its members represent 85% of the global output, 80% of global trade, and 2/3 of the population. But if it has been effective, that is because the most powerful nations have seen, so far at least, no fundamental clash between their interests. When the rubber hit the road on the Ukraine question, what happened? I mean, there's no consensus on that either. The continued logjam will be there in the G20 as much as in the United Nations Security Council. How is that different then? Why blame the UN then? The fact is that the UN has survived for the last 78 years, that is because it has evolved into a kind of multi-stakeholder institution that it is today, and carries with it great expectation and promise. If that promise is not fulfilled, it's not the institution that you should blame. It's the people who actually run that institution, the member states, that you should blame. And you should reform the institution, face up with the thing, update it. It is, as Sujan himself said, it is an institution that was built upon the post-war realities. You have to update it. This world has changed. You have to update it. I would not suggest its replacement by a smaller or less representative institution, nor would I agree that we should encourage nations to abandon the world body in its current state. The United Nations must not be allowed to suffer the fate of the League of Nations. The people of the world cannot allow that. Now let me go back to what the United Nations is. I think we need to at least recapitulate that. The late Kofi Annan once said that the United Nations is rooted in 4 powerful ideas of exceptional inspirational power: peace, independence, development, and human rights. I won't go into all the details of how it has been described, but one of the most important and historic contributions of the United Nations during its early decades was the process of decolonization. The very fact that today the United Nations has 193 members as compared to 51 nations then when it was founded is testament of this. This in itself is a major achievement, especially for the smaller nations of the world. True, new issues of governance, fragility, and state stabilization have come about. These issues have given rise to major dilemmas and problems within many of the new states. It is when the interests of the great powers across the world have clashed and caused confrontation that we have seen the outbreak of tension and exacerbation and inherent fragilities within these smaller states. The unipolar moment after the end of the Cold War witnessed an upsurge of hubris which wrought its own damage in world affairs. With the revival of division and polarization now among the great powers, the dangers to multilateralism have assumed new shapes and forms. But the core responsibility of the United Nations has always been to maintain international peace and security. The Council, the Security Council, is therefore what has been called the geopolitical cockpit of the United Nations system. And the dominant role of the P5 is a reality. Indeed, it is part of the basic structure of the United Nations. Now, that basic structure needs to change. It's clear that it needs to change because the facts of the world, the realities of the world, and Sujan has mentioned very, very clearly how countries have actually changed, and therefore this particular format has to change. At the end of the Cold War, actually Boutros Ghali, the Secretary General in 1992, did mention this, but nothing came of it. As the 21st century progressed, the mismatch between the structure of the UN Security Council and the global reality has become more and more glaring, and it is increasingly recognized that for the continued existence and relevance of the UN, it is necessary to ensure that it represents as nearly as possible the reality of the power equation in the 21st century world. Now, it has been done. Many people have tried it. In the UN, there have been large numbers of proposals. In fact, even the president of the UNGA had brought forward a resolution, but eventually, because of the differences within the member states, it was not pushed to a vote, and what you have now is a rotation every year. During his visit to the world body, Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, spoke strongly this time too about the need for a time-bound plan for the reform of the world body, including that of the Security Council. At the Voice of the Global South, Prime Minister Modi stressed the formula of respond, recognize, respect, and reform. I think that is what we need to do. And I think it is necessary for the world also to face up with this. And we should, even though there is the reality and danger that it may not come immediately, we just keep moving it. I think that's the most important lesson we have to learn. Just because a thing is difficult, you don't really abandon it. You have to go ahead and keep pressing on. On the pillar of development, and I must say that it's not peace and security, as Ambassador Chinoy said. The G20 itself has been very active on other issues, developmental issues, climate change issues. On the pillar of development, I must say that the UN has pioneered an entirely new concept of human development in the Human Development Index, which the UNDP has brought forward. The whole question of the fate of the LDCs, what is called the least developed and the landlocked countries, they were the ones, it was in the UN that their ideas, it is there that their plight is discussed and action taken. And these are probably not publicized as much, but the UN has done some signature work in that. These priorities were consolidated in what we call the MDGs in the early part of the century, the Millennium Development Goals, and since the Rio Conference in the SDGs. They were brought out during the SDG meeting. There was the Sendai framework which came about, the financing for development in Addis Ababa, the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris. The SDGs today are universal and apply to all countries. And I think as the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon explained at the time of the SDGs, we have to focus today increasingly on the 5 Ps: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. Today, sustainable development means development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to make their needs. But even here, an important organization that deals, an organ of the UN that deals with development, the ECOSOC, is actually treated as a poor cousin because it's the Bretton Woods institutions represented in the fund, the bank, and of course, the old GATT and today's WTO are the organizations that are built on different principles. And as Ambassador Chinoy showed, not necessarily representative even of the economic power of today's world, who are running many of these, making international decision making. And it is therefore the ECOSOC that needs increasingly to be given power. Some of it is happening, but not enough. Again, here, I think there is need through, more recently, there have been new powers like China and India who talked about competing new institutions. I suppose this will be a kind of a test to see if the old institutions can actually be challenged. But ultimately, I think it is in the UN system that these should all actually converge. And I think unless that is done, and the economic part of the Council, the economic part of the UN, perhaps in an Economic Security Council, unless that is done, I don't think we'll have a truly universal way to address the problems of development. We have the other problems, we have the other issues of human rights. Here again, human rights is one of the important pillars of the UN system as a whole. And yet it is treated, in a sense, in a cavalier fashion by the countries that perhaps need it the least, and in a contemptuous fashion by countries that need it the most. So I think it is important that the United Nations system itself show and often show the mirror to situations inside countries, speak truth to power in terms of the need for human rights to be recognized around the world. India has supported these activities, but it believes that the UN should play a promotional role that seeks to strengthen national capacities and offer national best practices. Naturally, the idea of human rights based on human values is a much more composite idea, which is being addressed increasingly, not only by countries of one part of the world, but increasingly by parts which represents the cultures and civilizations of all parts of the world. Some of them are treaty-based, some of them are charter-based. But globally, it is important that the increasing role of civil society organizations in the articulation as well as in the focusing of civil society problems, civil rights problems, should be increasingly encouraged. The Council, actually the Human Rights Council, does have some important institutional mechanisms that it is using today, like the Universal Periodic Review and the special procedures, which have over the years shown important, it has placed the focus on important areas and focused on places where there have been grave and persistent violations of human rights. We've said never again on many of these issues. The new concept of responsibility to protect has come in. Some of it has been quite, in fact, when India in 1971, in a sense, raised the problem of the genocide in Bangladesh, people talked about it as interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Subsequently, Rwanda took place, and there was a major outcry around the world. Srebrenica took place. Today, the responsibility to protect is recognized as an important principle. But there too, take the question of Libya, and you can see the responsibility to protect becomes a kind of an excuse for regime change. And I think these are issues which are not problems with the principle as such, but the way in which that principle is implemented. Let me come back to some of the points which Ambassador Sujan Chinoy had mentioned: climate change, international terrorism, and the issue of forced migration and refugees. Over the years, in terms of climate change, in the past 3 decades, more than 200 multilateral environment treaties and more than 2,000 bilateral agreements have come into force to protect endangered species, restore the ozone layer, regulate hazardous waste disposal, clean up the atmosphere and oceanic pollution, and to mitigate climate change. These have been done through the United Nations. And I think that has to be recognized. And it is important that we not only recognize it, but give greater strength to these multilateral institutions, because very often it is a 1-man or a 3-man delegation. I knew a delegation from Samoa, which is a small spot in the Pacific Ocean, which had 3 people who were experts on climate change issues, and they actually piloted some of the most seminal sort of meetings and agreements in this issue. That is the kind of leadership that we need, not necessarily only of the most powerful countries, but those who can, as we've used the term compassion so much over the last few hours now, and in the C20, that is an expression of compassion, because they understand where the soup pinches. This is not to suggest that even today, despite the various arguments that are used, that there is no progress. India itself has been a spearhead of much of the progress that is taking place on climate change. Some positive developments we are seeing. Net zero is becoming a reality. The cost of renewables is declining. Electric vehicle sales are taking off. A new appreciation of the value of nature is emerging. And in fact, new lifestyles are generating in order to address the question of environment, which is the role which increasingly countries which are affected and which are in a position to make a contribution are doing. India is at the head of them. I think these are important. On the question of tackling terrorism, let me very quickly come to some points. Terrorism has been talked about here over the years since 1999, actually. After 9/11, there have been new Security Council resolutions. Whole new institutions have been set up in 2005, 2017 in the United Nations. But as Ambassador Chinoy once again said, the definition of terrorism has evaded the international community for a variety of political reasons. But here too, the effectiveness of the mechanism, whether it is the FATF action or other actions, depends not so much on the institutions. There is a whole structure of institutions which have been set up on the United Nations. But if one permanent member is going to refuse to accept a particular placing somebody on the grey list, there you are. That's once again a problem. Therefore, you need to address the problem of who is standing in the way of these developments and show the mirror of the reality to the world as a whole. And the role of civil society is very important here. Finally, on forced migrations is another thing which is coming increasingly in the limelight in the world more recently. Again here, UN institutions are there to focus on improving, on finding charters to treat with refugees, forced migration as well as unforced migration. But it is the sense of urgency, the sense of priority, and the committedness of the more important and effective states that is important. Ultimately, I think we need to address the question of attitude. Who does the UN serve? I would like to just make one question, and that is one point, and perhaps again, Sujan will probably remember that in our first postings in China, we had acquaintance with what is called the Red Book of Mao. One of the things in the critique of the Yan'an was, "Wei shimmer the wanti, zhongyao de wanti." You remember that? Now that in Chinese says the question of for whom is the most important question. For whom is reform directed? For whom do you want multilateral reform of the multilateral system? And I think if India today is to play a role, it has to play a role on behalf of the global South. And it is, I'm happy to say with a certain amount of responsibility that the Prime Minister of India has said that. As he said at the February meeting, we, the global South, have the largest stakes in the future. 3/4 of humanity live in our countries. India has always shared its development experience with the global South. Our development partnership covers all geographies and diverse sectors. I don't need to repeat what we have done in terms of COVID, in terms of the various other, and what in fact India has offered in terms of the UPI and other things which you've mentioned. But most important is not really the biometric identification, digital public goods, all that. What is of fundamental importance to the developing countries, the small and medium countries that look for leadership from outside, is a sense of compassion, a sense that we understand where the shoe bites, and an ability to be able to reach out and do something to help what they think are important. I think for that, we need to have been in their position. And I think India can quite sincerely say that we do understand this, and we need to actually the unfortunate thing is, and this is perhaps an element of cynical reality, that once you become powerful, you probably change your attitudes. And I think nobody expressed it as well as Swamiji today when he talked about the instance of Drupada and Drone. I think that is a reality which the world needs to recognize, need ourselves to correct ourselves, constantly look at our faces in the mirror as political leaders, as officials. Are we actually changing our own features as we launch on this Amrit Kal, as it were, of our own development? We need to be conscious. And again, to quote from a different civilization, at the hour of your greatest defeat, you think of your victories. And at the hour of your victories, you think of your defeats. That is what gives balance. And if there is a way in which we can present this need for balance, I think it is through an institution like the United Nations. The C20, the B20, the Y20, the G20 are important stepping stones to this. Where we find that it is not working, we use alternate avenues. As you said, you sit, it's a wayside kind of a station where you look, you watch the movements and you try to make corrections. I hope that in this project, India leading the G20 at this particular stage of its history, was an opportunity for us to really make for reform and build a resilient United Nations. Thank you.
So your words have truly touched each of us here. Thank you so much for your words of wisdom. It has inspired us to think deeper. It is my utmost pleasure to introduce Ms. Sunaina Kumar, the Executive Director at Think 20 India. She is a Senior Fellow at ORF and works with the Center for New Economic Diplomacy and focuses on gender. She has been a journalist for over 15 years and has reported on development, gender, and culture. She has worked as senior editor with the Indian Express and Open Magazine and has contributed news features to The Guardian, BBC, Der Spiegel, Al Jazeera, India Spend, and Mint, among others. As an independent journalist, she has reported on a variety of subjects from different parts of India, Germany, and Bangladesh. Her journalistic works has been supported by grants from the European Journalism Center, Dart Center of Columbia University, and the Robert Bosch Foundation. Ma'am, please, over to you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and good afternoon. Thank you to Civil 20 for organizing this joint event between C20 and T20. My job here is really tough because I am speaking after we have heard very persuasive arguments from experts of multilateralism, and I'm not one at all. I'm also conscious that there are students in this room, and we are doing a lot of these G20 Youth Connect events across the country. And we go into college auditoriums and we talk about multilateralism and G20 or macroeconomics and G20. And I do wonder what is it that the students get at the end of this program. And my hope is that even if a tiny seed of interest is planted after listening to everyone, and especially the experts that we heard today, then I think our job here is done. So I'm going to restrict my intervention on two themes. One is present a snapshot of Think 20. What is it that we are doing as an official engagement group of G20, since we are being hosted by C20 here today, and we are also working jointly together. And I will talk briefly about this morning's theme, which is multilateralism and how it connects with our work at T20 and why it is important for all of us in the room, even those of us who are not experts of multilateralism. So the Think 20, we are the ideas bank of the G20, and it is the role of Think 20 to present evidence-based policy proposals to refine and promote the priority areas that G20 has picked on, put it in the public domain, and engage with a wider audience, which is also here today, for example. The work of Think 20 is spread across 7 task forces, which are closely aligned with G20 priorities like macroeconomics, trade and livelihoods, digital transformation, green transition and life, the SDGs, and of course, reform multilateralism. So T20 India engages with more than 130 researchers and more than 100 institutions from G20 countries for its work, which is going on alongside the G20 presidency, and our work is spread across 7 task forces. All the work that we do is backed by research. We are in the process of publishing policy briefs, and the best ideas and recommendations from these policy briefs, from all the research and the convenings that we will put together and bring in all experts from G20 countries, will feed into the final communique. And that will be handed over to the G20 Secretariat. We have also organized key convenings with participation from G20 countries. 2 have already taken place in Delhi in January and in March. And the next one is in Mumbai in May. And the final T20 summit will take place in Mysore in August. We've also done more than 50 side events. So it's a very, very hectic year for everyone who is doing any work with G20, as everyone who's here from C20 would already know that. So that's T20 in a nutshell. About reformed multilateralism, it is one of our task forces, and Ambassador Chinoy, whom you've just heard, is also the chair for that task force, and he is really steering the work on multilateralism. And as we will be hearing many different perspectives, and we have already, of course, Ambassador Nambiar spoke about the importance of development in multilateralism. That's also what I will be speaking on, multilateralism in the context of development and the sustainable development goals, issues that the C20 is also engaging with. So at the heart of India's presidency of the G20 is the idea of inclusive and sustainable development. India is well aware that the emerging Troika of developing countries, which is Indonesia, India, and Brazil, plus South Africa, is an opportunity that simply cannot be missed. And this makes space for development priorities to be top of the agenda, whether that's climate financing, progress on SDGs, digital transformation, universal health, or gender equity. And I am focusing on development because in the G20 context, we cannot talk about reformed multilateralism without talking about development policy and reform of the current global financial order to address global issues that have become all the more urgent since the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis that the world is seeing. The pandemic, as we know, has reversed the progress on the SDG agenda in most countries around the world. And to counter that, what we need is innovative financing mechanisms for development finance. We need to reform multilateral development banks, and we need to create more plurilateral financing institutions that can address the socio-economic and environmental challenges that the world is facing. In 2020, the UN Secretary General said that the world faces a surplus of multilateral challenges and a deficit of multilateral solutions. And even as multilateralism has been questioned and challenged, its shortcomings have been revealed and its institutions have been discredited to an extent, it has emerged more relevant than ever. It does remain our best response to the pandemic and the crisis that have triggered from it. Multilateral institutions have proliferated over the last 2 decades. At the last count, according to some data that I found, there are more than 200 agencies and institutions in existence. And yet most of the share of development finance goes to only 10 international development organizations. And the question is, what if the rest of the institutions, 180 or more of them, could have the financial firepower to invest in global development? The last few years have made us more aware of global interdependence and the pledge of the SDGs, which is to leave no one behind. Challenges of health security, of food security, climate change, and all such can only be solved collectively. And this demands new ways of thinking about development policy and multilateralism. Multilateralism must find new ways to strengthen and protect social protection systems, to finance the SDGs, but also to make financing accessible to low income and developing countries so that these countries do not end up taking on more debt. By prioritizing development and finding new and sustainable financing models for it, multilateralism can solve many of the world's crises, while also solving its own crisis of credibility. These are some of the ideas that we are developing at Think 20 as part of our work. I will stop here and I will hand over to Colonel Pillay to steer us to the finishing line for this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Sunaina Kumar, for touching upon the pillars of T20 and multilateralism. Thank you very much. With utmost pleasure, I would like to now introduce Colonel DPK Pillay, who has had a distinguished career in the Indian Army spanning 29 years. He was awarded the Shaurya Chakra for his gallantry in evacuating wounded children in Manipur. He has had several field assignments and was selected for Project Beta, which delivered a handheld PDA for use by the infantry in counter-insurgency operations. He is currently pursuing research on violent extremism at Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. He is also a member of the Advisory Committee for Commemoration of the First War with Pakistan. Colonel Pillay holds a PhD from Punjab University and regularly conducts international humanitarian law training for UN missions. It's an absolute delight to welcome, sir. May I please request the IT team to put up the presentation? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this honor and inviting me here and share the stage with such distinguished. Thank you, Ambassador Chinoy as the chair of the T20, Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, and Dr. Vinod Menon, and Dr. Sunaina, and distinguished guests here, and your students. Firstly, it's an honor for me to be here because my mother was a great devotee of Mata Amritanandamayi, and she passed away last year. And I think it's a blessing that I'm here today and hearing her because, can I just change this like this? Okay. So she used to come very often here to the ashram when she was well. And there was like when we heard in the morning, when we heard Mata Amritanandamayi give the message, that, you know, you deliver, there are two ways of doing things. There are always the hard way and the easier way, the mirage. And I think the stories that were recounted by Amritaswaroopananda about the Mahabharata, and then you remember that, you know, when we read about the Mahabharata, we read about Abhimanyu breaking the Chakra view. It is something that he learned in the womb of his mother, you know, and he learned there's something that when you're being nourished by you inculcate certain values, you know, by being born in a particular family, by being born in a particular society, being born in the values that have been constantly. So when Ambassador Chinoy told me to speak on human rights and human values, learning from India, I said, sir, I can't really match the bandwidth that you have and, you know, the kind of stage, the panelists that I have here. He says, no, you're the right person to speak, because he said you must speak. And I'll just share this video here. How do I play this? There's a video. Can you just tell them to play? So This is the story not about me or anyone. It's just
In the
about
northeast of the country, soldiers of the army have often been accused of indiscriminately attacking innocent people in the battle against militancy. There are clear exceptions. This is the story of how an Indian army officer nearly died, saving the life of a young girl, and returned to her village to find the man, a former militant, who had shot him. Keshavlay Bhattacharjee has this special report.
An unusual reunion. A mother crying inconsolably after meeting an army officer who had saved her daughter and grandson's life, almost sacrificing his own years ago. And even more unusual is this meeting. The army officer hugging a former militant. They both came close to killing each other 16 years ago in the same attack. On 25th January 1994, Captain DPK Pillay was out on a patrol. That night when he reached El Pabram, 4 militants were waiting for him. In a fierce gun battle, one of them died and Pillay was grievously injured. He saw a young girl also injured in the crossfire. When the helicopter arrived to evacuate him, he insisted the girl be saved first. And as a dying wish, he convinced his men and his officers not to launch any attack on the village sheltering the militants. Pillay recovered and recently established contact with El Pabram and journeyed back to the village. The reunion was touching.
It's amazing to come back here to something that anyone would do, I think, because she didn't know what the reason why she's got shot. I knew what I was there for. They knew what they were fighting for. But what is their fault? So I think we owed them.
Village chairman Mr. Atanbo remembers every moment of that night.
उस समय पिल्लाई साहब ने माफ कर दिया हम लोग को जीवन भर में भूलेगा नहीं.
Masilu, the girl who was caught in the crossfire, is now a mother. Dingamang, the 6-year-old nephew of Masilu, was also injured in that gunfight. But Pillay wasn't prepared for this encounter, to come face to face with the man who had shot him.
Actually, I have a picture of him with me 16 years ago. Yeah, I can't.
Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that so this is not just my story or a story. This is the story of an Indian soldier, like we've been trying to say about the role Ambassador Nambiar talked about. Ambassador Chinoy also spoke about the kind of issues that we've been dealing with. So it is something that inherently comes to every Indian. It's something that we learn. So you don't need a universal declaration of human rights to actually recognize the rights of others, develop compassion in you. These are stories that you hear. So when you hear about Ashwatthama still languishing around because he killed young innocent children, and having to live being cursed to be an immortal and to suffer constantly, is because he did something totally unethical. And when you hear about Draupadi forgiving Ashwatthama for the murder of her children, it is something that shows that forgiveness, reconciliation is something that has been ingrained in us. It culturally comes down into the way we live, the way we talk, the way we conduct ourselves. It is something that is there in all our. So even though the rest of the world, for them, it was a big thing, the liberty, freedom, and all those things, those ideas that came in along with the French Revolution and the American, independence, Declaration of Independence, and others. For us, it has been part of our life. We don't need a universal declaration of recognition, where we say that all human beings are equal because of just by the fact that they are human. It is there ingrained in all our things. You see the Ashokan edicts, which you find, just deployed all over. So I was in Iraq for a while as a military advisor, and that area, the Levant, is a place where 3 great religions of the world have been born: Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and others. And they talk about, the Cyrus cylinder in which, but when you compare that with your own civilizational things that are there, mentioned in your Rig Vedas and the Atharva Veda, you realize that we've got much more wisdom and knowledge. And, there's this Hammurabi's code, which is so brutal, actually, in many ways. You find that. But yet, we don't find that in our everyday discourse. I don't know how, the Western people have kindly omitted this. So you find this is the site of Kalinga, the elephant that you see on the right. It is a rock inscription that has been put up in that place after, which lays out exactly, which clearly even says the kind of trees that cannot be cut, which is something which is really unimaginable today. That is like 2000 years ago, around 300 BC or whatever. So it's amazing that they could even think about the kind of people who are protected, the people who are going to be protected. That he very clearly says that these tribes are protected by under the Priyadarshini's protection. They cannot be harmed, So those are things that if you go to these places, you'll find the translation of these edicts. You'll find this, it'll be something that is very inspiring. So like I already said that, it is there. This is a Rig Veda hymn, and compare it with the UDHR of 1948, in which Eleanor Roosevelt played a great role. But this very clearly says that no one is superior or inferior, because all are brothers and should strive for the interest of all and should progress collectively. And even in Chanakya's Arthashastra or the concept of Ram Rajya, where you find the kings used to go in disguise, to find out how the subjects are. It's mentioned very clearly in Arthashastra, which is something which is an amazing document, the kind of knowledge and wisdom that this has. And that has been handed down to us culturally. So it doesn't really matter, and these things which are talked about, the right to physical liberty, right to shelter, right to life, these are all part of our everyday scores. So when India became independent in 1947, these are the things that were promised to us, where we have social, economic, and political justice. We have an equality of status, opportunity before law. It doesn't matter which sex you belong to, which race you belong to, which tribe you belong to. And there was freedoms. Now, how do we understand that? Have we walked the talk? Because there were two countries that became independent around the same time. There was Pakistan, created on the basis of religion, and there was an East Pakistan, and there was a Western wing of Pakistan, and there was India, which was there. Now, if you see the first elections of this country, I used to wonder why is that we have a symbol. But it's so wise of those people at that time that they realized that more than 90%, 80% of our people are illiterate, and they didn't know how to recognize letters. And they said that, okay, there was a sign and you have to vote for that sign. And till today, we continue that. And we have made sure, our election commission makes sure that even for one man's vote, they deploy helicopters to go there and carry out something that is so fascinating. And that is something that our aim of our country has been to mainstream our people into it. So you don't find any stories of, like when you heard about the Peshawar school attack in 2015. Next day, they announced that they've killed 100 militants. We don't have that kind of a disproportionate response. Even here, what happened in East Pakistan, which is a Muslim country, and they were Muslims, there was a cyclone that struck them in December 1970. Over 5 million people were killed and displaced. But the West Pakistanis didn't recognize the equivalence of them as fellow Muslims, fellow citizens, and they failed in delivering aid and everything. So this is one of the first climate-induced disasters, if we can also be counting that. And they completely ignored them. There was anger. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, a tall leader in his own right, he came to power. The Western wing couldn't accept the fact that a Bengali would be, and then they unleashed Operation Searchlight, and and Ambassador Nambiar talked about the responsibility to protect. And that is the time, like we were on the menu of the powers. We were not on the high table. We were being eaten up. Like the Western powers were actually, Henry Kissinger and Nixon established contact with China at that time and asked them to intervene. They had the 7th Fleet moving here. But India did what was expected, what was failing in Rwanda, what was failing in Srebrenica, and that's something. We took care of 10 million refugees, and then we intervened there and we established a new country, Bangladesh today, which fares much better than its parent country in many parameters. In fact, even it beats India in many things. So if that's the responsibility that we've actually walked the talk. It's not just in allowing our own people, but even in the case of the AIDS epidemic in the early. When AIDS had come as a disease, I was a young boy just out of college. I remember there was a deadly disease, and we all knew that if you got it, you died, and the treatment was so expensive. And then, somewhere in 1970s, India had come up with a patent act, which we said that, we can't be paying patent money for products that are for indefinitely. We were paying for phenyl, something like a patent, to a company that didn't even own it. And that's when the government of India decided that we patented the process, not the product. And because of which we could really manufacture, which was required. And then when AIDS became an epidemic, the way it was, what did we do? We came up with $1 a day treatment. Cipla had a cocktail of 3 drugs. And when it was presented in the United Nations that they would go, there was an entire lobby of the Western nations, because the top 10 pharmaceutical companies are richer than the rest of the 500 in the Fortune 500. They lobbied against Indian drugs, and they made ads showing that if you ate an Indian drug, you became a snake, or you became those kind of advertisements came out. But yet we persisted, and today the world, it was costing $15,000 and it came down to $360. And then people in Africa and the poorer nations could actually counter this scourge of effective. And then we've seen that in food crisis. We were living in I grew up in a time where we, even though my father was in the army, I know that we got limited rations. We got 5 liters of kerosene oil, because if you're in Jorat, you needed that Petromaxes and everything. We got 5 kgs of wheat. And why did we get that kind of a thing? Because Lyndon B. Johnson, the president of the United States, had put us on a 1-month leash. So the food used to come only if we behaved, because Indira Gandhi had spoken up against the Vietnam, what is happening in Vietnam. And they put us on a 1-month leash, and the food wouldn't be available. And that's the time that we turned around our disadvantage into something. So if you go to Africa today, or you go to any of these countries, they look up to us because we come like them out of colonization. We've broken our shackles from that completely period of colonization, and we've done what we are. Even recently, in the natural calamities that we've seen, we've done a very great job every time without there are no strings attached. And we don't have our aid workers roaming around in, Pajeros and Land Cruisers, which spend more money, and they deliver the aid that is delivered. I work for an international aid agency, the Red Cross, and I've seen how we work in, those conflict zones of Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And I felt guilty in many ways, because the kind of money that we splurged on ourselves was like probably a family would live for that for a month. Even now in Corona, when the world struck, we didn't have PPEs, we didn't have vaccination, but we became the pharmacy of the world. We delivered, and this has been something that we can all really be proud of, the vaccine Maitri. And I wouldn't like to speak about this now anymore, because I would get the foreign minister of Gabon to speak. Can you please click that? Can you just click? Now he's speaking about
India has to take care of 1.3 billion people. In a democracy with smooth transitions, can you imagine having to take care of 1.3 billion people and still having the time at the policy level to say, let us look to see what we can do for the rest of the world, when multilateral institutions should be doing that? So I will dare say that India is a multilateral institution in its own right. In its own right. When you think about their commitment to humanity, India obviously is providing leadership at a global governance level, and that is commendable for one country, 75 years old. Think about it. In our lifetime, we have industrialized economies that were never colonized, some who were colonized centuries old in terms of their post-independence. But you don't get the same attitude and commitment and conviction as you can get from India.
So it's something that we can all be proud of. He may say that we are a 75-year-old country, but we are actually an ancient country. And today we celebrate Ram Navami. It's an ancient, something that, if you read the Ramayana and you read the geography, I can't describe my directions to my own house, which I come and go. But if you read the Ramayana and you see the description of the Ram, the thing, and how he's gone to Sri Lanka, and the Park Strait today, which they call the Ram Setu and others. And even in the Mahabharata, when they describe those things, it is amazing to imagine that somebody could be so precise about all this geographical. We are an ancient country, and we've grown stronger with every influence that has come to us. We can't be exclusive. We are an inclusive country, like we've adapted. We've assimilated them. So like you see, Bangladesh was broken away because they didn't assimilate them. Whereas if you can look at all the problems that we had inherited from the time of 1947, there was a war foisted in Kashmir, which is an artificial war. Essentially, it was the Europeans, the British wanted to have a toehold in that region, because it was their fascination for that Rudyard Kipling's great game and everything. They wanted to continue to be there. And they created an artificial, which is never meant to be a haven for anyone. It proved themselves wrong in 25 years. They broke apart. So the fact is that it was never, but you see, we had problems in Kashmir, we had problems in Assam, in Manipur, Nagaland, Tripura, and others. Today, you find them all former insurgents. Our DG hosted a former insurgent who was the head of the Liberation Tripura, the Mizoram National Chief Minister now, Zoramangtong. He came over and we're very proud to say. So what have we achieved? We've mainstreamed an opposition. Somebody who took up arms against us today is now talking to us and being part of the system. And that is the strength of our country. That's the strength of our civilization, where we don't destroy. I think that is the thing. And this is a universal prayer that we have, which is something that we know, which is something which is very fashionable, where it talks about, may everyone be happy. Pursuit of happiness is a right for everyone. It's not like, it's and may everyone be healthy. And that's what we've done in our thing. So, and free of illness and others. So I'll end with this. Thank you very much for this honor and privilege.
Thank you, Colonel Pillay, for your insightful words. I would like to extend my gratitude to the distinguished speakers for their talks and to the audience for participating so far. Now we'll move on to the question and answer session. Can we have 2 mics? I'd like to now invite the audience and also our participants who've joined online to ask questions to our distinguished panel members.
I would like to just mention that this is an opportunity of a lifetime for the people who are very young, the young students who are sitting here. This is an opportunity to interact with veterans from the field of diplomacy. Ambassador Chinoy and Ambassador Nambiar, who have outstanding experiences in handling many of the issues in nation states where we feel that in governance, we have hard states, soft states, failed states, and fragile states. So they have actually handled this in a very great, complex situations in conflicts, and also handling conflict situations in terms of problem solving through diplomacy. And having also held very distinguished positions advising the Secretary Generals and in the United Nations, Special Advisor to the Kofi Annan, and also the Chef de Cabinet with Ban Ki-moon, Secretary Generals. I think with Ambassador Vijay Nambiar and Ambassador Chinoy. This is an opportunity as the Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, and also handling several other positions as a patron of the Indo-Japan Forum, as also advising many groups and think tanks, and the most appropriate choice for being the chair of the think tank 20. I feel that, if you have any questions, please use this opportunity to kindly share your doubts, raise your questions, and interact with Colonel Dr. D.P.K. Pillay, and also with Sunaina Kumar, with their distinguished experiences and insights. Thank you. Over to you. Any questions from the audience in person, and also for those of you who are attending online? This is being live streamed, and so if you have any questions, please send the questions either online or even in person. Over to you. Anybody, please raise your hand and introduce yourself and speak. Dr. Hema.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is out of curiosity, this question, I've been having this question for a very long time. why can't we raise our voice against the developed countries to be more mindful about their consumption? Because when these people reduce their consumption, we can achieve the sustainable development goals like no hunger, no poverty. I think at least it would average.
Well, I think the essential problem is that the industrialized nations took all the time that was required, a full 150 years, to develop their economies, to industrialize. And they began at a point of time when there was no notion of climate change or global warming. And so they were in a position to spew as much poison into the air or to pollute as much as was required, to use as much of the earth's resources as was required to get where they are today. And the global order in which we currently exist, it is not an equal world. We have to accept that reality. It's a fact that the global institutions have privileged presence, and then there are the masses. It is a reality. So to expect that they will, as a result of a sudden change of heart, come out and behave differently is, in my view, unreasonable. But we must not give up on the power of conviction. It is not necessary to engage in street level demonstrations, even in the G20. But the idea is to see that as we sit across the table in the G20 with the G7, the ones that you describe as the most conspicuous consumers of the earth's resources, the ones who polluted the earth the most, the ones who now ask the developed world to consume less and to achieve net zero before they have developed. These are the people that we have to convince. These are the nations through the power of our values and our ethics. The global order will never change because of a change of heart. But we must not give up that hope. It takes normally cataclysmic events, wars, economic downturns, implosions for global orders to change. But the existing global order can be reformed, can be made better. And we have to convince them that if we have to make that green transition, it has to be a just and equitable green transition. Where will, after all, the finances come from? For climate change action alone, the world will require for green transition about 4 to 5 trillion US dollars annually. It will take countries to devote 4 to 5% of their GDPs in the developing world to reach that kind of green transition. Where will this money come from? And if this money does not come in an equitable fashion, nobody's target of net zero will actually be meaningful. For global warming is something that straddles national boundaries. So let us keep up this pressure through the power of ethics, morality, a new way of thinking, a new way of pointing the world in another direction where they will realize that for them to be successful in the future, they must also think of the global community as a whole. They must temper their consumption. Their per capita emissions are 2, 3, 5, 6 times that of India even today. India has emerged as a very resilient economy today. Post-pandemic, it is the world's most resilient economy. It is the world's fastest growing economy. During Amrit Kal between 2022 and 2047, India will emerge as the world's second or third largest economy in nominal terms. We will emerge by the time we celebrate our centenary of independence, we will emerge as a developed nation. And this is something that rides on the shoulders of the young people sitting here. Hopes and aspirations of millions, if not more than 1 billion youth in our country. But power of conviction, power of values, ethics, compassion. We have to tell the world that there is this alternative path. Amma said this morning, there is one path that takes you to death and destruction, the other one that takes you to a new kind of awakening. We have to tell them that there is this choice. Those that have only the binary choice of offers made by great powers that are themselves contending and negating one another, India can rise and give them the third choice. We are the country that has had the third eye as well, a different perspective, drawing from our deep wisdom and civilization. And there are others in the world with similar wisdom, especially in our part of the world. We can join hands. Thank you.
Just, I think he said all that needs to be said. I'll just add two things in terms of background. In international discussions, there has already always been among the developed and the developing countries two major terms, as it were, used. Historic responsibility, which is the historic responsibility which Ambassador Chinoy mentioned for pollution, which the industrialized nations have actually had to bear because they were earlier in the game of industrialization. They could pollute without any sense of responsibility. So that historic responsibility needs to be recognized. And the second term that is used in these kind of discussions is common but differentiated responsibilities. I think that means that everybody has a common responsibility towards doing and contributing towards zero emissions, towards both adaptation as well as mitigation targets, but they are not necessarily the same. It cannot be done on an equal scale. It has to be differentiated because not only is the responsibility differentiated, but the historic responsibility is different, and also their ability to cope is also differentiated. So there is this question of common but differentiated responsibilities. For example, the small island republic in the Pacific Ocean, it has the most to suffer from, to adapt to in terms of ocean, or the rise in the levels, etc. But it doesn't have the means and the wherewithal to be able to cope with this. Therefore, the international community has the responsibility, international organizations have the responsibility to take immediate action to see that their situation is salvaged in some way. You can't say that this hard luck. You can't tell a person. I've been to Tuvalu, places like that, where, I mean, it's almost it's about less than a few inches above sea level, and the sea is virtually going to encroach on them within days. And in fact, in Maldives, during I think it was about 10 years ago, the Prime Minister had a cabinet meeting underwater. They had a cabinet meeting underwater. Now these are, and yes, well, these are things which show very dramatically the situation among the vulnerable countries. And this is the kind of situation which a country like India recognizes, even though in terms of our own historic responsibility, I don't think we can share, we can be justly accused of have the responsibility which Western industrialized nations have. But at the same time, in terms of responsibilities to contribute towards ameliorating the effects of climate change, I think the current government and the previous government too have taken some monumental decisions. I think which no country can. I mean, I think it is praiseworthy around the world, whether it was in Paris or whether it was subsequently at the last Sharm el Sheikh conference when the Prime Minister talked about the Panchamrit and things like that. These are, and Solar Alliance, etc. These are huge things which a developing country like India, which I think the Guyana Foreign Minister said so graphically. I mean, we have shown ourselves to be a multilateral institution by the kind of measures we have taken to in a sense address questions which are of real and present danger to developing and vulnerable countries around the world.
Dr. Vishwanathan.
My question is to Sujan Chinoy. You talked about one of the T is basically talking about trade, which is also leading to a lot of tensions. We all know that. You also mentioned that 80% of the trade is confined to the G20 countries. Now, from the point of view of equity and to the rest of the world, which is beyond the G20. How G20 countries can actually ensure equity as well as well-being with respect to the rest of the G20 nations? Thank you.
So I think I want to repeat this point that currently all the known vectors of globalization are under challenge. I had mentioned the 6 T's, but when we look at the vectors, we are often referring to trade, technology, global finance, and movement of human resources, which make for globalization as we know it today. Globalization is also a process. It's a genie that cannot be put back into the bottle. Trade in particular is fungible, and it is by and large riding on demand and supply in a globalized world. So therefore, the question really is how to make that whole process of trade based on demand and supply more equitable. And I think one of the key points here is fair, equitable market access. Now, we have seen how in the WTO, some countries have gamed the system. Others have not been able to make full use of the opportunities provided by globalization. There are many countries in the world that can produce similar things, high volume, low cost. But even these countries, and that includes India, found that supply chains were drifting away from them to other parts of the world. And an undue and unhealthy reliance and dependence was being created on certain geographies. These geographies that were accumulating supply chains and concentrating supply chains within their own territory were themselves not inclined to open up their markets on an equal basis to others. This is on account of systems. The liberal democratic trading order is vastly different from state-led capitalism of the type that we see in autocracies, and some of them have been very successful as economic powers. They are the ones that have gamed the system. They are the ones that seek access to supply chains and markets around the world, but are not equally willing to give access to their own markets. This is being today challenged by the global community through things like establishing new structures for resilient supply chains. And I think, therefore, the global community must discuss these issues. One of the difficulties that arises in discussing these issues is the inefficiency in the WTO, the weakening of the WTO. Its inability to even put in place appointments for the appellate mechanism, where the positions of judges have lain vacant. No positions have been filled. The dispute resolution mechanism is in tatters. And countries, therefore, are now inclined to move towards what you call protectionism, regionalism, mini FTAs, to engage in bilateral, trilateral, plurilateral structures. For a country like India, it has to also look at these global structures such as the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, in which India is not a member, or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, keeping in mind the interests of its population, national interests. So I think, on balance, I would say that until the world provides equal access to markets, until countries stop gaming the system, when we see the end of the unnecessary use of tariffs and non-tariff barriers or technical, impediments to imports and exports, etc., until we see the end of this, it's very difficult to make for a fair and liberal trading order. Once we do that, as we are trying to do that through our Atmanirbhar Bharat campaign, through our production-linked initiative, incentive scheme, PLI scheme, we are not seeking to disengage from globalization. We are not seeking what you call self-sufficiency. We are seeking self-reliance of a type that allows us to move up the value chain to make the Indian economy and manufacturing in India more competitive, such that we are able to better participate on equal terms in the global trading order. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question and answer. So now we move on to the plenary 2, Governance for Resilient Multilateralism, Inclusive and Participatory Approaches. It is my absolute pleasure to invite Professor Vinod Menon, the Working Group Coordinator for Sustainable and Resilient Communities, Climate, Environment and Net Zero Targets. He is also the founder member of National Disaster Management Authority. Sir, I humbly welcome you to address the gathering.
Thank you very much. This session is actually supposed to be for sustainable and resilient communities. We are trying to give you an overview of this working group, which is actually hosting this T20, C20 joint consultation. And this is one of the 14 working groups of the C20. And out of the 14 working groups, we have 5 working groups actually anchored by the Amrita University faculty members. So this is one of those 5 working groups from Amrita University, the Sustainable and Resilient Communities, Climate, Environment and Net Zero Targets. So we have very close emotional and intellectual and academic involvement and engagement with the concept which you have been talking about, Ambassador Chinoy. And I think this is very important. Next slide, please. So Amma has actually, been giving the blessings in terms of, many of her guidance has actually been extremely valuable for all of us who have been in this mission of trying to understand how spirituality can actually provide, the scope and an opportunity for understanding the challenges in terms of what people are actually going through, whether it is the 17 goals of the sustainable development, or whether it is the disasters, climate change and extreme events, or whether it is the urbanization and many other challenges which are actually facing humanity now. We need to really look at the solutions from thinking with the heart. And that is also what Ambassador Chinoy has been mentioning, that, you need to think with your heart and then, you will find solutions coming automatically. Next slide, please. The initiatives are essentially driven with compassion as a human value, which is driving all volunteerism efforts and all civil society efforts. Compassion is actually the spirit of volunteerism. So we have also the compassion-driven chaupals, which are happening in many states in the country, in many villages, interacting with communities, in understanding their problems and also trying to find solutions. We have the Amrita faculty and the research scholars who are interacting with the communities on the ground. So we have many instances. So this is actually moving away from, from self-centered goals to selfless societal goals. And that is compassion. And that is the spirit and the guidance and the blessings of Amma, the chair of C20, which has been guiding and providing the inspiration for all our efforts. And building solutions that can actually provide very useful for humanity around the world, and making people and communities happier by reducing their suffering by compassion and selfless service. So we have many campaigns. One is the Acts of Compassion, the Seeds of Hope, which is also looking at environmental sustainability. Next slide. So compassion-driven, empowering the youth, empowering citizens, and empowering communities. So compassion becomes really the value, the human value, which really drives people. And we have seen that actually many of the conflicts which people are facing in many countries around the world are driven by, conflict coming out of greed, coming out of, the need to really support the efforts of, aggression, the way in which you're trying to expand your territories. Next slide, please. So in terms of the compassion-driven, sustainable and resilient communities, Amrita University has been having several initiatives. One is the Live in Labs program, which is delivering developing champions and also interdisciplinary initiatives, sustainable and resilient community resource centers, and global partnerships and networks. Amrita University has been associating with more than 300 universities abroad, and also having several collaborative initiatives with corporate leaders like Esri in geoinformatics, centers of excellence happening also in many institutions. Next slide. So we have the C20 chair, and we also have the C20 principal coordinator, Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, and then we have the working groups. We also have an international executive committee and a steering committee. And we have 4 sub-themes. The first sub-theme is on climate resilience and social justice. The second is on environmental sustainability. And the third is on net zero emission targets. And the fourth one is on compassionate approaches to sustainable and resilient communities. Next. So in terms of the vision, we are basically trying to understand the challenges and try to find solutions, and also basically to develop the policy initiatives in terms of preparing the policy briefs for key sectors. And this is also what the think tanks are doing. And many working groups and task forces of the Think T20 are also coming up with the policy briefs and policy solutions. So we are also working on similar sectors, on energy, on climate, on environment, and on also looking at compassionate approaches towards sustainable development and resilience building. So we will actually come to that in terms of the strategies and practices, and also the policy briefs, which are actually coming out of many of the working groups, which are actually part of sub-themes. Next slide. We have Dr. Maneesha Sudheer, who's actually in Maneesha Ramesh, who was supposed to be doing this presentation. She's the coordinator for this working group. Unfortunately, we have been all in Sikkim, and we had a meeting with the Sikkim Chief Minister, who is going to inaugurate an event on the 29th and 30th of April. She has fallen ill because of the extreme pressure of the work in the inception meeting, and also following the meetings in Sikkim. There is also the flu and the fever, and also COVID, which is also coming back. And so, we need to actually also be very careful. And so health is important. And so we need to really work on that. And I'm there, and also Dr. Adisivan, who is there in the Mother Amriteshwari Society in Malaysia, who is also another international coordinator. Next slide, please. So we have International Executive Committee with Professor Rajiv Shah from Keio University. He's one of the Sasakawa Award recipients from the UNDRR for the work which is done. He has published authored more than 65 books in disaster risk reduction, resilience building, and so on. And we have Harold Dreger, who is the president of the International Emergency Management Society based in Oslo. We have Dr. Puji Pujiono, who was also associated with the C20 in Indonesia, and he's with the Pujiono Center in Indonesia. And we also have Dr. Salimul Haq, a climate change champion, and also one of these ardent advocates for the Loss and Damage Fund, and he has participated in many of the COP events around the world. Next slide, please. So we have these 4 major sub-themes, as I mentioned. Next. So in terms of looking at each of these, we have been holding several events in many parts of the country, and we have been interacting with more than 700 CSOs from G20 member countries, and also from the invited guest countries, and many international collaborations and many discussions are going on. And we are also very happy and honored that we have the World Malayali Council Global, which is working in more than 60 countries, and they're also partnering and collaborating on environmental sustainability issues. And we are also handling several campaigns on the Seeds of Hope, which is Amma's vision of sending more than 1 million seed balls to be distributed to communities which are actually having to protect fragile wastelands and also wetlands, which need to be protected. So we have Seeds of Hope campaign And the details are also there in the brochure which we have circulated. Next slide, please. So I will not spend more time on the detailing of these various sub-themes because, we are running really short of time. And then we also have a very distinguished ambassador, Ambassador Amb Venu Rajamony from Jakarta, who is currently attending a conference in Bangkok, but he will also be joining us and he will also be addressing. So I think we will go through this in terms of various activities which are there in climate change and social justice, environmental sustainability and compassion-driven efforts, net zero targets. In terms of the progress so far, we have actually conducted several events, and right now, actually, we are having another event which is going to happen on the 7th of April on environmental sustainability issues. We also have another event which is being done along with the IMDR, the Institute of Management Development and Research in Pune, and the Deccan Educational Society, Ferguson College, and so we are doing an event on climate finance on the 8th of April. And we have several such events which are actually happening with collaborations with Climate Action Network South Asia, which has 300 organizations in 8 South Asian countries, and a part of CAN International, which is a global climate action network advocacy group all over the world. So we also have many other partners. So we have called for udaharans, which are exemplars of good practice examples from civil society organizations. And so we have received several examples of good practice work from many civil society organizations in India and also from many G20 member countries and invited guest countries. So right now there's an international jury which is evaluating them, and then we will also be coming out with the publication and also a video documentation of some of these outstanding shortlisted best practice examples. We are also planning several other events. Some of the events which are completed already, we had the inaugural meeting and networking event which was done in hybrid format. We had many people who were participating online. We had more than 1,644 people attending from several countries. We have also other events which are done, including one on the policy dialogues. We had several events like that, and also the Sea Chowpals, which are interacting with communities on the ground, and awareness campaigns on many themes. We have been doing that. I wish to conclude here, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share what the working group is doing. Now, my request for the presentation on multi-hazard preparedness and changing climate. And this is essentially work which we are really concerned about, because when we talk about going through COVID, we feel that the bottom line in disaster management is that anything can happen anytime, anywhere. And COVID has actually taught us that. So we would like to basically look at the multi-hazard risk governance in a changing climate, because risk governance is extremely important. And that is one of the themes which we would like the G20 task forces and the working groups also to really address in G20. Next slide, please. Antonio Guterres said that legacy for the coming generations is resilience building. So he said that disasters cost hundreds of billions of dollars, hitting the poorest countries disproportionately and pushing millions into poverty. And we must tackle disaster risks and leave a more resilient planet to future generations. Next slide. So in terms of looking at disaster management in a cycle, if you look at disaster management as a cycle, you have on the upper half the pre-disaster phase, which has 2 P's, preparedness and prevention or mitigation. These are the 2 P's. And in the post-disaster phase, we have 3 R's: response, rehabilitation, and recovery. Response is basically relief, restoration, and other activities. But we find that the pre-disaster phase, the 2 P's are very strong for all the developed countries. And so because of that, when a disaster happens, they are able to respond very fast, and without actually a ripple effect, they're able to really come without paralyzing the whole economy and the whole community and the society. Next slide. Next. So why is risk governance important, and why it should be strengthened? We have increasing frequency and impact of disasters, climate change, and extreme events which we are facing. Poor people are often more vulnerable to become victims of disasters, and anything can happen anytime, anywhere. And community preparedness for worst case scenarios strengthens resilience. And that is something which we want to really work with communities at risk not only in India, but in all the G20 member countries and the invited guest countries. And multi-hazard disaster management plans must be prepared to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. And intergovernmental platforms like SAARC and ASEAN and the Organization of African Union and the national governments must be prepared for disasters, climate change, and extreme events. And Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, said climate change is a code red for humanity, which means that this is something which we have to really take it. And with a very distinguished army officer, armed forces officer like Colonel Pillay, and we know that code red means that this is something which humanity has to really take it very seriously. And disasters and terrorism are two problems without borders, said Kofi Annan, who was a former Secretary General. So next. And during COVID, the message from the UNDRR was that no one is safe until we are all safe. And that is something which is very important. And then we need to really see that, we are safe. We all have to be safe. And UN also has said that leave no one behind. And UN has also said, do no harm. But we find that this is actually something which is extremely difficult, to leave no one behind and to do no harm. And that is where multilateralism really has to step in and to see that the vulnerable people, the poor people, the interstate migrant workers in India, or the migrant workers who are coming from other countries, internally displaced people, the refugees and environmental refugees need to be protected. And that is where multilateralism can really make a very strong move. So we have in G20, we have a disaster risk reduction working group, a task force which has been set up. I think that they will be able to take this idea forward. Next slide, please. So in terms of the four major global frameworks which are actually active from the period 2015 to 2030, there is a Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and the UNFCCC's Paris Agreement for climate change, and the Sustainable Development Goals with 17 goals, and the UN Habitat's new urban agenda. These are important, four major global frameworks, and they only have another 7 years to go. And so that is very important, that we know we need to really use this next 7 years in a critical mission mode to really try and see that we are able to achieve many of these global targets. Next slide, please. So in terms of disaster management's importance, we have seen that with 683 million people affected by COVID in 229 countries, and with more than 6 million people dying as per official records from the WHO, but unofficially, it is probably many, many millions more. And we really do not know how many people have actually lost their lives due to COVID, because some of them have been reported as people who have died because of organ failure or cardiac arrest, or many others, even though they were COVID positive. And so there is a need to really look at some of these. And the coronavirus pandemic has actually cost the global economy between 5.8 trillion and 8.8 trillion, and according to the ADB, the Asian Development Bank. And we feel that when slow onset disasters are added to the Asia Pacific riskscape, the annual economic losses is about $675 billion as per SCAP. So which means that we are really losing a lot of money because of disasters, and many of them are uninsured losses. And so we need to really look at insurance, reinsurance, and risk transfer instruments. And I hope that the T20 will actually address this issue, because we find that whether it was Chennai floods in or the earthquakes which have happened in Sikkim, we find that there has been a lot of loss of property, assets, and infrastructure, including traders, including small artisans who have lost everything, but they are not insured. So we need to really look at some way of risk transfer instruments for these people who have been hit by disasters. Next slide, please. So in terms of multi-hazard preparedness, the need to really look at training programs to be conducted, organizing public awareness campaigns, carrying mock drills, conducting village level task forces, organizing them, and also establishing early warning systems, preparing disaster management plans, preparing stockpiles of sandbags in flood-prone areas, establishing community multipurpose shelters, identifying buildings for relief camps, etc. And these are all efforts which has to be handled with community engagement. And that is where multi-stakeholder partnerships happen. And we need to really look at all the SDGs, and we feel that the goal 17, which is on partnerships, is most important. And that is where I would request Ambassador Chinoy and all of you to really look at is expanding the bandwidth of partnerships in T20 and also invite in academia, institutions which can actually participate. And Amrita Vidyapeetham will be very happy to collaborate in terms of many events where we will be happy to associate with your initiatives in any task forces, any of the working groups where you feel we can add value, because we have 1,800 faculty members with multiple domain experiences, and whether it is in IT, information technology, IoT, or artificial intelligence, expert systems, and various other fields, and also in health and various disciplines in various sectors, including social work and so on. So we would like to offer the support from Amrita Vidyapeetham to the T20 initiatives. Next slide, please. And disaster risk management, we feel that there is a second bullet. There is a renewed pressure to consider whether global governance systems are fit for our purpose and on how they could be improved. Even as we reconsider traditional threats to peace and security, we need to update these concepts in our more complex world, in which local threats may quickly become global, existential, and intergenerational. So said Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General. And sustainable and resilient pathways warrant a shift from endangering development to engendering development through women-led development strategies. And this is something which we would like to submit for your consideration, that the engendering development, women-led development, if you could kindly consider that as an approach from India, highlighting the need, because half the planet is actually, they say that half the sky is held up by women, but at the same time, in terms of recognition and involvement and engagement, women are not really into decision-making, into consultation, participatory processes. So we would request that. Next slide. Next slide, please. So in terms of the need for investing in multi-hazard preparedness and disaster risk reduction, I would like to leave this thought with all of us, that for every $100 spent on disaster-related development aid, only 50 cents goes towards protecting development from the impact of disasters, according to a UN report which is released in 2021. And academic studies find that every dollar invested in DRR, disaster risk reduction prevention, can result in savings of $3 to $15 in disaster losses. And investing in disaster risk reduction is not attractive for government leaders because these are for disasters that don't happen. But however, distribution of relief after disasters is a photo opportunity. And so many people feel that that is something which actually is more glamorous. But however, investing in disaster risk reduction can help people. We saw that the Turkey earthquake, which happened with the 7.8 and the 7.6 earthquakes on the 6th of February, we saw that it actually had cost about $84 billion of damage, 84 billion with a B. And we feel that investing in a few $1 million in terms of preparedness would actually help resilience building of communities in disaster prone areas. Next slide. I think that's the last slide, which says disasters are not natural. Disasters are happening because of human interventions with nature. And that is where Amma's message of working with communities to really protect nature becomes really important. And we feel that early warning is important, and we feel that we will all work together and bring all stakeholder groups, whether it is from the corporate sector, whether it is from governments, whether it is from civil society, and whether it is from self-help groups. We all need to work together, because if you do not do that, we are becoming a part of the problem. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry that we've taken more time.
How much time?
There's a slight delay as we wait for the next speaker to join. Okay, so we have our next speaker joined us online. With utmost pleasure, I introduce Ambassador Yauvoli. He has over 30 years of experience as a Fijian diplomat and civil servant. He has worked at international, regional, and national levels, including a stint at the World Trade Organization headquarters and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He has held several distinguished leadership roles throughout his career. Most recently, he served as a Director General in the Malaysian Spearhead Group Secretariat and as the Fijian Ambassador for Climate Change and Oceans. Sir, a hearty welcome to the Policy Dialogue. Sir, can you please unmute?
Okay. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon from Bangkok, Excellencies and gentlemen with all with all protocols observed. Start my video, okay. Sincere thanks for the invitation to participate in this policy dialogue, and really appreciate the support, particularly from my friend, Professor Vinod Menon. I know I have 10 minutes to squeeze this huge topic. Please bear with me. The topic that I've been asked to talk on is on SEEDS, the small island developing states, about multilateralism in a world getting torn with conflicts, climate change, and extreme events. First of all, to provide a scene setting in regards to this topic, I think it's important for you and me, I mean for the audience, to understand who are this group of countries, the small island developing states. In the UN nomenclature, a group of small island states consisting of 30 UN member states and 20 associate members are members of this group. And the political life of these groups as independent states, particularly for the 30 states, started in the late 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. So most of these countries gained political independence or independence from the colonial masters during this period, particularly for those in the Pacific region. A notable development then that once all of them gained political independence, they joined the United Nations at varying times, time period. For instance, when Fiji gained independence from the British on 10th of October 1970, we immediately joined the United Nations on December the same year. So what that entails is the importance of joining the UN, immediately recognizing the pivotal role of multilateralism through our nation building. We are not as old as other big Asian countries, and we hope that the examples that I'm drawing on from the small and developing states, particularly for the Pacific, will give insights into the importance of multilateralism to this group of islands, to this group of countries under the SEEDS nomenclature of the UN. Joining the UN is important, is critical for these countries, the group of countries, as I said, it's about 30, in advocating issues of interest in our respective nation building at the global level. For us, multilateralism remains the bedrock of our survival in a highly competitive world against our specific social, economic, and environmental vulnerabilities. Because we are small and vulnerable, the small and developing states, our collective interests are placed in our confidence and trust in the multilateral system, particularly the UN, as the bedrock of multilateralism. Not to depend on our special situation to determine our destiny, but the importance of multilateralism to propel us forward, moving our nation building and economies forward, particularly in this day and age. In 1992, at the first Rio Summit, as well documented, the UN recognized for the first time the vulnerabilities of these island states in terms of environment and development. It accorded a special case for small island developing states. Also in 1992, we saw the birth of the Rio Conventions. As we all know, the UNFCCC, the UN Framework on Climate Change, the Biodiversity Convention, which is the UN Convention on Biodiversity, and the UN Convention on Desertification. They were born out of 1992 in Rio. At the same time, it saw the birth of a program of action for the sustainable development of small island developing states. And this is called, well, acronymed BPOA, which is making reference to Barbados in the Caribbean, as the first host of this landmark meeting in 1995 that saw the birth of a UN program of action for the sustainable development of small island developing states. Its 10-year review was the Mauritius International Meeting, which was held in 2015. And its 20-year review was the Samoa Pathway that was held in Samoa in 2014. So its 30-year review will be in 2024, which is next year. So this is providing a background to how we came up as a group at the UN, and which will also provide some historical context in the discussions that we're having now. The second point that I would like to raise is that our confidence in multilateralism is heavily challenged. That has slowly eroded by conflicts that infuse social and economic repercussions, particularly the impacts of climate change and extreme weather events that has tested our resilience, and also that has adversely affected us in the last couple of decades. So with that in mind, we all know that it heavily affects our sustainable development aspirations as small island developing states. So let me just look at the conflicts. What sort of impacts does the conflicts have? For the Pacific, I will speak particularly for the Pacific, and also I know this is common throughout the small island, the SEADS region, the Indian Ocean and the African Ocean, as well as the Asia region. As a result of the Ukraine-Russian war, the Pacific has not been sheltered from the price hike that linked us to the war, that affects food, fuel, and now daily living conditions in the Pacific. The cost of fuel post-war is now increasing by more than $1 a day, $1 in some of our countries in the Pacific. As we know, if you don't know, we heavily depend on petroleum for about 72% for all our electricity generation, and essentially 100% for transport energy. As you know, we are islands. Apart from being connected amongst the nations, we are also having challenges connecting internally, because we have to depend on diesel to travel from island to island in the communities of the Fiji Islands or any other community of the SEADS group, like Maldives and the others in the Caribbean. The sad point about this is that, as I said in my early introduction, I am currently in Bangkok attending the 10th Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development, leading the Fijian delegation. We have noted and we have seen that now that we are assessing our SDG accomplishment, we are regressing heavily on our SDG 7. SDG 7 is on clean energy. So for the island nations, of the smaller island states who depend heavily on petroleum, for transport and also for movements internally and also for accessing energy, this is a big issue for us, and it has regressed in the current assessment. So we hope that there will be momentum moving forward. So this is one of the big challenges that we face through conflicts. The other issue under this item, I would say, on climate change. As I said earlier, in 1992, we were recognized as the most vulnerable group, being particularly at risk, and we are yet on the front lines of climate change. That's the recent IPCC report, AR6, as we all know, is all seen. Deaths from floods, droughts, and storms and climate-induced weather events are 15 times higher in vulnerable regions in the small and developing states. And the Asia Pacific region, as we know. While at the same time, this is the irony that we, small and developing states, are faced in terms of multilateralism. We noted that the Asia region is the highest emitters of GHG emission. In 2021 figures, it's more than 60% of global total. So the question really is that, will multilateralism bequeath a world for our future children in the same order that we are enjoying now or not? And this is a serious question for us, a discussions, a dialogue that needs to be undertaken at all levels at the UN. So we as SEEDS are facing the full brunt of these adverse effects of climate change and weather events. And with the AR6 report that I mentioned earlier, there's a possible temperature overshoot. And again, we have been emphasizing in Paris at COP21, our slogan 1.5 to stay alive. And we thank the international community, like our good partners like the government of India, for supporting us to go through this 1.5. But yet, we are facing the risk of climate temperature goal overshoot. So let me just try and wrap up my interventions. I know I just like to emphasize that should the UN SDGs 2030 Sustainable Development Goals to be achieved, we need to progress it. Right now, it has regressed heavily, not only in the smaller developing states, but in the Asia Pacific region. And we are regressing by decades. So this is an issue of concern for us. And we are hoping and counting on the G20, which India is currently the presidency of, to take this leadership role, very strong leadership roles, and push forward, push the momentum forward, so that we can be able to see momentums in the coming years. On that note, let me also thank the G20 for taking this mantle in looking after the issues of small and developing states, because we were part of the G20 last year under the Indonesian presidency. And we hope that whether Mauritius or one of our sisterly island states are in the G20 now, they will continue to bring, to advocate for the issues of common interest for small island and developing states in the G20. So what is the way forward for us? The way forward for us, just one more minute, we're looking at genuine partnership. Genuine partnership is the only way that will take us forward. We thank India, for taking this lead role, for the mantle in the G20 presidency. We count on your leaderships, to infuse genuine and long-term partnerships that are sustainable, that can be able to bring back, to bequeath this world to the future hands of our children and our grandchildren, and deserves. And of course, they deserve to be accorded that the world given to them in the status that we are enjoying it right now. Our multilateralism deserves to be reformed. That will be my last point, and to continue, in order to continue to serve its noble objectives. I thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Yauvoli, for your insightful words. I would also like to thank Ambassador Venu Rajamony, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, Ambassador TCA Raghavan, who stayed with us online and had to drop out because of prior commitments. Now, I'd like to invite Professor Sudha Arlikati, Associate Professor, School for Sustainable Development and Research Head, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Amrita. I'm truly honored and privileged to propose the vote of thanks this afternoon. Please let me start with my humble pranams to our Chancellor Mata Amritanandamayi Devi, our beloved Amma, for her divine grace and presence in Amritapuri, making the Amritapuri campus hallowed ground. Her video message inspires us to be the light to facilitate change that is for the betterment of all by choosing the right pathway of compassion and giving. I thank Professor Vinod Menon for his warm and inviting welcome address and subsequent presentations about the workings of the C20 Working Group on Sustainable and Resilient Communities. My humble appreciation and gratitude to Sampuja Swamiji for his emphasis that we should work towards the goal of achievable nonviolence. He referenced the Mahabharata to explain that as long as negativity exists in our minds, war and conflict will exist. So we must move away from this. My appreciation to His Excellency Ambassador Sujan Chinoy for his keynote address. Thank you for taking time despite your busy schedule to grace this occasion in person and for raising our awareness to the 6 main axes of tensions plaguing our world today. 1, trade as a source of tension. 2, technologies such as AI and weaponization of these. 3, territory. 4, terrorism. 5, tenets as narratives of governments who believe they are superior to others. And 6, finally 6, trust or lack thereof, and what countries can do to work towards coming together. He explained that India has the unique opportunity to contribute to being decisive, inclusive, and action-oriented. Thank you very much, sir. I also express my heartfelt thanks to His Excellency Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, the Sherpa for the C20, for his valuable contributions. He emphasized the need to address the question of attitude and examine for whom is the reform directed at. Then understand how India is poised to play a very big role in helping the voices of the global south get really elevated. I am grateful to Dr. Sunaina Kumar for presenting a snapshot of Think 20 activities and highlighting their schedule filled with over 50 side events across the country, which also encourages the participation of the youth. This is really empowering for them. Your words of encouragement of how multilateralism is being discussed in the context of sustainable development goals is indeed heartening. I'm humbled and grateful for Dr. DPK Pillay, retired colonel from the Indian Army, who reminded us of the value of human rights and human values. The video of his valor and humane actions and compassion left an indelible mark and memory amongst the at-risk communities and built bridges of compassion in years to come. My heartfelt thanks to His Excellency Amenatave V Yauvoli, Ambassador Extraordinary of Republic of Fiji to the Republic of Indonesia, for joining us just now virtually and explaining the vulnerabilities of small island states and how multilateralism is their bedrock and how we should really work towards bettering it. Thank you all, heads of the various departments at the Amritapuri campus, the faculty present and the students over here, and people working behind the scenes for trying to make this a success. I leave you all with this inspiring quote by Amma. Progress is not possible without discipline. A nation, institution, family, or individual can advance only by heeding the words of those who deserve respect and by obeying the appropriate rules and regulations. Children, obedience is not weakness. Obedience with humility leads to discipline. So thank you, everyone. Members on the dais, off the dais, and also joining us virtually. I think there are about, I think about 28 people. So with that, and apologies for some of the students having to leave because of lunch break, which they only get for a short time. So apologize for that. Thank you very much for your patience with us. Namaskar.
With this, we come to the formal end of the program. Thank you very much, everyone.